The Nature of True Prayer by F.L. Rawson. Chapter 11, Mental Suggestion. Proofs that mental suggestion is not used. When I first started to get results by right thinking, the medical men whom I knew said they were obtained merely by mental suggestion and impressing the patient strongly that he was going to be healed. The first case which satisfied them that this was not so was a case of drink. A Christian Scientist came to me to ask for help for her son, a man of over 40 years of age who was drinking himself to death. He had had nothing but liquor in his room for over a fortnight and was in the last stages of delirium tremens. She told me that she had tried to get help for him from the Christian Scientist, but they had refused on the grounds that he had not asked for help. He called himself an atheist or an agnostic, I believe. At all events, he was very bitter against religion and especially against Christian Science. Personal treatment. The Christian Scientists, in treating, as a rule, realize the spiritual reality of the patient and, in a case of drink, for instance, realize that the patient is not a material man, but is a spiritual being in heaven who cannot possibly desire drink. As a rule, a case is taken personally. That is to say, the practitioner, so to speak, talks silently but mentally to the patient and says, "You cannot possibly desire drink, for you are a perfect spiritual being in heaven." When treating personally in this way, it is very difficult to prevent thinking a little of the material man. If the patient has asked for help, it is, generally speaking, a sign that his mind is not very bad, and that even if the practitioner does think a little of the material man, it will do no harm. If he has not asked for help, his mind may be very bad, and in some cases, thinking of his so-called material self, even very little, may upset him. Often, the practitioner, not understanding what is happening, calls this chemicalization, which is quite a different thing. The effect of thinking of him is as though a piece of string were tied onto his mind and you were pulling at it. If his mind is very bad and the practitioner thinks a good deal of him, he may be entirely upset. Impersonal treatment. When working in the proper way, whereby one does not think of the person at all, neither of his material self nor of his spiritual reality, no harm of this kind can be done because the practitioner is treating himself, getting out of his own mind the false idea that man is a material being, sick or sinful as the case may be, and trying to realize the perfection of God and man, the real man. Instantaneous healing of drink mania. The Christian Scientist in question told me she had heard that I had taken cases of this sort which had been successful and asked me to take her son as a patient. I told her I could not do this as I had too many people waiting at that time, but I would give one treatment. He was at the time in the south of England and I in my office in the city. He was completely cured at that moment, and about 8 years afterwards, his mother, in passing through London, said that she felt she must call and see me to thank me again for what had been done. He had had no difficulties of the kind since and was a changed man. When I was attacked by one of the papers advocating spiritualism, they invited any of their readers who had been cured by me to communicate directly with them. I believe they expected to hear of a number of failures. As a matter of fact, the only letter of the kind was from a doctor who wrote saying a relation of his had not been healed. This was because after a short time, as the patient would not treat for herself and would not take any trouble or even try to read, I refused to continue, telling her that as she would not take my medicine, she could not expect it to help her. Amongst the letters was one from a lady whose husband had suffered from drink for many years and was getting worse and worse. She wrote to the paper saying, "I called upon Mr. Rawson and told him and asked him for help. Mr. Rawson gave an audible treatment, and to my astonishment, When I got home, I found my husband, who knew nothing of my visit to Mr. Rawson, at dinner drinking water. Since then, he has not touched drink of any kind, and the difference between this and the times in the past when, by willpower, he has forced himself to abstain from drink is this: he has had no desire of any kind. This was in 1913, and I saw the lady a little time ago, and she said that he had had no trouble since. These two instances are enough to prove that the healing is not done by what is now called mental suggestion. Silent mental suggestion. There is one form of suggestion which is not recognized except by mental workers, and that is silent mental suggestion. It is almost as effective as when you audibly suggest to a person. The silent mental suggestion was the basis of most of the sorcery and witchcraft of olden times, although it was not known what was being done. Paracelsus, one of the ablest men of olden times, had considerable knowledge of medicine and was the first to introduce the use of metals as drugs. He took every opportunity he could of learning all about occult matters, and for this purpose used to wander about for months in the company of gypsies and people of the lower grades. For this, amongst other reasons, he fell into disrepute among his fellow workers. In one of his writings, he pointed out definitely that the clay figures into which pins were stuck by the witches had nothing to do in any shape or way with the magic or spells and the various incantations they used to chant, but were used so that they could concentrate their mind better upon the part of the victim they wanted to harm. At the same time, it must be recognized that the witches were not harming the victims. It was evil thoughts, impersonal evil, attacking both the witches and the victims. Unfortunately, in those days, people did not know how to pray in the right way so as to protect the victims and change the mind of the witches. Consequently, they used to burn anyone whom they thought was practicing black art and working in this way. In those days, if you wanted to get rid of an enemy, the simplest way was to hide a brazier or skull and crossbones, etc., in the rooms and then go and lodge a charge against them, saying that they had killed your red and white cow, giving it some obviously ridiculous or impossible disease. It helped if you said that you had seen them seated across a broomstick, flying out of the cowshed at midnight. If you could get someone else to swear it as well, you were certain of a verdict. And the victim was promptly burnt amongst the howls of those looking on, who went away feeling just as satisfied as many do now when they see a thief caught red handed and taken off to the police cells. In treatment, it is always advisable to work against the effect of such mental suggestion, and you can do this by realizing that there is no mental malpractice. Man is surrounded by divine love. There is no aggressive mental suggestion, for there are only God's thoughts. There is no hypnotism. God is the only power and the only ruler, etc. It has often been said that in Christian Science, one does not use mental suggestion. As a matter of fact, when you are praying personally, that is to say, thinking of the spiritual reality of the person and talking mentally to the person, as many do, you are using mental suggestion. When you say, for instance, "You have not got consumption, your lungs are spiritual and perfect, for you are the Son of God, divine, made in God's image and likeness," you are really using mental suggestion. Only it is not recognized to be this, as a different meaning is now attached to the words mental suggestion. It would be advantageous if a committee were formed in order to define, as far as possible, the meanings of the words used by mental workers. It would save a good deal of the misunderstandings that now necessarily take place through the same words being used to express different ideas. Aggressive mental suggestion. The apparent effect of aggressive mental suggestion has to be recognized and dealt with. Most have heard of cases where, for a joke, a man's friends have, one after the other, told him he looked unwell, whereas at first he was perfectly well, with the result that in a short time he became ill. Some, like myself, have heard stories of the victim dying as the result of the malpractice. I have only had one actual case firsthand of this. A man came to me in distress. A terrible thing had happened. He did not give me his name or the place where it had happened, but by the way he spoke, it was evidently some large store or government department. As a joke, he said, various members of the staff, one after the other, had told the head of their department that he looked very ill, and at 10 o'clock the same morning he went home. To their horror, he was dead by 1 o'clock that day. Dr. Schofield, the well-known medical authority on the human mind, told me of a case which he mentions in one of his books. Two well-known medical men of Edinburgh were arguing as to the effect of mental suggestion. To prove his case, one of them called to a man near and after asking him a question, told him that he was looking very ill and ought to go home to bed. He gave him his name and that of his friend, both of them well-known medical men. The man went home to bed and was dead in a week. The Daily News, in reviewing Dr. Schofield's book, containing an account of the incident, said that it was a case for the public prosecutor, that nowadays it was just as much murder to do such a thing as to fire a pistol in a man's face in order to see what effect it would have upon him. Foreseeing the evil and destroying it. I remember after one of the first lectures I ever gave on how to think rightly, one of the well-known medical specialists came up to me after the meeting and said that for the first time in his life, he had put before him a theory into which all his known facts fitted, and he now saw what a lot of harm he had done in the past. He asked me not to mention his name to anyone, as the medical profession had rather curious views about mental working, and yet he was one of the leaders. He had had a case only that week where a woman had been brought to him for diagnosis. He was the 13th medical man she had been to, and none had been able to tell her the cause of her trouble. As the door opened, even before he had seen the woman, he knew, he told me, what the disease was. Within 2 or 3 days, all the symptoms of the disease came out, caused, he now thought, by his strong thinking that she had this trouble. He thought he had given it to her. As a matter of fact, he had read the thoughts and foreseen the disease. If he had known how to pray rightly, he could have stopped it coming in the same way that a friend of mine destroyed the cinema pictures of the accident in the lane and the bombing of the hospital, as mentioned in the testimony columns of active service on November 4th, 1916, after they had been foreseen by a lady staying in his house. 3 members of his household have had this power of seeing the future. I now know about 100 who have been able to see the future. Some of them see it constantly, and when evil is foreseen, it practically always is destroyed, and the evil does not take place. Another friend of mine, a well-known medical man, who used to get sometimes as much as 50 euros for his diagnosis, told me that often he had no apparent reason for his opinion, he just knew what the trouble was. He admitted it was thought reading. On one occasion, I went with a leading doctor who was a specialist on the human mind to help him test another doctor who said he had the power under certain circumstances of reading thought. My friend said he had 3 things wrong internally and no one except himself knew what they were. I thereupon treated, knowing that man being spiritual and God the principle of all knowledge, man knows instantly everything he needs. At once, the other medical man stated accurately what the 3 troubles were. Prophesying. A very noticeable change during the last years has been the great increase in the number of people who can do this. Joel, speaking of the latter days, writes, "And ye shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God, and none else. And my people shall never be ashamed. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit. And I will shew wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call. Joel 2:27-32. The first verse is already fulfilled. We know now that we are the 10 tribes of Israel, and that the Lord is our God, and there is nothing but God. The next 2 verses are now taking place as above mentioned. The following 2 verses show the prophecy of the way in which the end of the world would come if it were not for man's knowledge of how to pray, as not only would the earth burn up, but the heavens as well, that is, all the constellations. As Peter points out when he says, "The heavens shall pass away with a great noise," this is the shout or trump spoken of elsewhere, namely, the realization that there is nothing but God. And the elements shall melt with fervent heat, the earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. Later, St. Peter says, we should be looking for and hastening unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens, being on fire, shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Dissolve is the biblical name for dematerialize, and it is used by several of the prophets in connection with the end of the world. In the next verse follows the recognition of the prophetic vision also referred to in Revelation 21:1. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new, a doublet of now, heavens and a new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. 2 Peter 3:10, 12, and 13. There are bound to be preliminary signs of this before what the prophet Joel speaks of as the great and the terrible day of the Lord, which is the final day when the whole universe will be burned up, which day, or at all events, the major portion of it, will be entirely eliminated by man's prayers. It is interesting to note that St. Peter, in his account of the end, does not speak of the great and terrible day of the Lord, but of that great and notable day of the Lord, Acts 2:20. He, like Joel, points out that at that time, whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved, verse 21. The final verse in Joel, above quoted, shows the way in which we are going to be delivered from the troubles that are now coming upon us. To call on the name of the Lord means to realize the nature of God. In Mount Zion means in thinking of God, and in Jerusalem means in thinking of heaven. The remnant, whom the Lord shall call, are those of the children of Israel whose minds are sufficiently spiritual to recognize the second coming of Christ, now coming like lightning all over the world, and to hear the voice of God calling, "Come out from among them, and be ye separate." 2 Corinthians 6:17. That was chapter 11, Mental Suggestion. Join us next time for chapter 12, Personal and Impersonal Treatment. See you then.